In a room full of sharks, everyone was looking for the king. Little did they know, the most dangerous man in the city had spent the last 6 months holding the car door open for a woman who didn't even know his real name. To Alara, he was just Leo, the quiet, mysterious driver who never complained about her late nights or her boss's insults. But tonight, as the richest men in the country tremble at his feet, Alara realizes the man she thought was her protector was actually the man the entire world was hiding from. This is the moment the lion stopped playing the part of the sheep. Before we proceed, kindly hit the subscribe button to enjoy more stories. The fluorescent lights of the city flickered against the sleek, black windows of the sedan, casting long shadows across Alara's tired face. She didn't look up from her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a desperate race against a midnight deadline. To the board members at Sterling and Cross, Alara was a rising star, a relentless machine of productivity. But in the quiet of the backseat, she was just a woman fraying at the edges, drowning in the cutthroat politics of a firm that viewed empathy as a defect. In the front seat sat Leo. To Alara, he was a fixture of her daily routine, as reliable and silent as the engine of the car itself. He was the man who appeared at 6:00 a.m. without fail, the one who navigated the jagged maze of city traffic while she rehearsed her presentations. She knew almost nothing about him. She knew he wore a crisp black suit that always looked far too expensive for a driver's salary. She knew he never spoke unless spoken to, and even then his responses were clipped, professional, and toneless. "Leo, can we move any faster? If I'm late for this briefing, Marcus will have my head," she muttered, not looking up from a spreadsheet that blurred before her eyes. "The bridge is backed up, Miss Alara," he replied. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through the leather of the seats. "I will have you there on time. Do not worry about Marcus." Alara let out a weary, cynical laugh. "Easy for you to say. You don't have to deal with him." Leo's grip on the steering wheel didn't tighten, but his gaze remained fixed on the rearview mirror. From his perspective, the world looked very different. He watched the reflection of the woman he had been assigned to protect, seeing the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Alara saw a man driving a car. Leo saw a battlefield. Behind those calm, obsidian eyes was a mind that didn't just see traffic patterns. He saw tactical exits. He noted the black SUV that had trailed them for 3 blocks before turning off. He recognized the specific gait of the man standing on the street corner as a lookout for a rival syndicate. While Alara worried about quarterly projections and the condescending sneers of her male colleagues, Leo was calculating the wind speed and the trajectory of a bullet that would never find its mark as long as he was drawing breath. He had spent decades in a world where power was measured in spent shells and silent disappearances. Now, he was playing the role of a ghost, a shadow in a chauffeur's cap. He was a man who had commanded armies of the underworld, yet he sat patiently while a mid-level executive treated him like a piece of furniture. Alara closed her laptop with a frustrated sigh and leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. "Sometimes I wish I could just disappear," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Just for a day. No phones, no Marcus, no expectations." Leo caught her eye in the mirror for a fleeting second. For the first time, Alara felt a strange, cold shiver run down her spine. There was a weight in his gaze, an ancient, predatory stillness that didn't belong to a driver. It was the look of a man who didn't just disappear people, but one who could make entire empires vanish if he grew bored enough. "The world only demands what you are willing to give it, Miss Alara," he said softly. "Perhaps one day you will stop giving them so much." Before she could process the strange gravity of his words, the car glided to a smooth halt in front of the towering glass monolith of her office. Leo was out of the car in an instant, opening her door with a practiced, humble bow. As she stepped out into the rain, she didn't notice the way the street urchins and the local thugs instinctively cleared a path when they saw the man standing behind her. She walked toward the lobby, already lost in her spreadsheets again, leaving the shadow in the front seat to wait in the dark. The morning air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and expensive cologne, as the black sedan pulled up to the curb of the firm's headquarters. Alara stepped out, her mind already racing through the day's agenda, but her path was immediately blocked by a gleaming, neon-orange supercar that had drifted aggressively into her space. Out stepped Julian. He was the silver spoon of Sterling and Cross, a man whose position had been bought by his father's connections rather than earned through the midnight oil Alara burned daily. He adjusted his silk tie, his face twisting into a smirk as he looked from Alara to her understated black sedan. "Still riding around in this relic, Alara?" Julian asked, his voice carrying across the plaza to ensure the gathering interns could hear. "I thought the firm gave you a raise. This looks like something a high school history teacher would drive to a funeral." Alara felt the familiar heat of embarrassment crawl up her neck. "It's a reliable car, Julian, and Leo is an excellent driver. We're just here to work." Julian's eyes drifted to Leo, who stood by the driver's side door, his posture perfectly straight, his gloved hands folded in front of him. To Julian, Leo was nothing more than a prop, a low-wage servant who existed to be mocked. Julian sauntered over, his expensive Italian loafers clicking on the pavement. He took a long drag from a gold-filtered cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke directly into Leo's face. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his gaze fixed on a point in the distance that only he could see. "Does it speak?" Julian laughed, turning back to Alara. "Or is it voice-activated? Hey, Leo, or whatever your name is, clean this." With a flick of his wrist, Julian tossed the burning cigarette butt onto the hood of the car. It skittered across the polished paint, leaving a faint, charred streak before landing near Leo's feet. Julian then raised his foot and planted a heavy, mocking kick against the sedan's front tire, leaving a dusty scuff mark on the pristine rim. "Julian, stop it," Alara hissed, rushing forward. She felt a wave of genuine panic, not for Julian, but for the indignity Leo was suffering. She turned to her driver, her eyes full of frantic apology. "Leo, I am so sorry. Please just ignore him. He's had too much caffeine and not enough manners." She reached out, instinctively brushing the ash off the car, hood with her own hand, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll make sure it's detailed later. I'm incredibly sorry you have to deal with this." Leo finally shifted his gaze. He looked down at Alara, and for a split second, the air between them seemed to turn to ice. He wasn't looking at her with the resentment of a servant. He was looking at her with a profound, terrifying pity. He saw her bowing and scraping to a man like Julian, a man who, in Leo's world, wouldn't have been worthy of cleaning the blood off his boots. Leo's eyes then moved to Julian. They were cold, not with anger, but with the chilling indifference of a predator watching an insect crawl toward a trap. Julian, blinded by his own perceived brilliance, felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver. He stepped back, his smirk faltering for a heartbeat as he met Leo's stare. "What are you looking at, driver?" Julian snapped, trying to regain his bravado. "Get back in your cage." Leo's voice was a low, smooth vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The car is fine, Miss Alara," he said, completely ignoring Julian's presence. "You should get inside. You have a reputation to protect." Alara nodded quickly, grabbing Julian's arm to pull him away before he could escalate the situation further. She practically dragged the laughing bully toward the glass elevators, shouting back one last, "I'm sorry, Leo," over her shoulder. As the lobby doors swung shut, Leo remained by the car. He looked down at the scuff mark on the rim, then at the cigarette butt smoldering on the ground. He pulled a burner phone from his inner pocket and dialed a single number. "It's me," Leo said, his voice stripped of its humble driver's tone. "I've found a few more weeds that need pulling. Start with a man named Julian. I want his father's credit lines frozen by noon. And tell the boys, I'm tired of being a driver." The office was a tomb of glass and silence as Alara slumped at her desk, the glowing red invitation to the Vantablack Gala staring at her like a mocking eye. In the world of high finance, an invitation wasn't just a social event. It was a test of survival. Marcus and Julian had made it clear. If she didn't show up to network with the investors tonight, her projects would be gutted and handed over to someone with a more prestigious pedigree. But the Vantablack wasn't just a party. It was a display of obscene wealth where the dresses cost more than her college education, and the jewelry was guarded by ex-special forces. She looked at the few outfits hanging in her office. Quality professional wear, certainly, but in that ballroom, they would look like rags. She felt a familiar, crushing weight in her chest. She was a girl from a middle-class suburb trying to play a game where the entry fee was a soul she wasn't sure she wanted to sell. The elevator chimed, and Leo appeared in the doorway. He wasn't supposed to come up to the executive floor, yet he walked past the security desk with a quiet authority that made the guards look away, paralyzed by an instinct they couldn't name. In his hand, he carried a heavy, midnight blue garment bag. "Miss Alara," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. "It is time to prepare." Alara wiped a stray tear from her cheek, trying to reclaim her professional mask. "I can't go, Leo. I've looked at every rental shop in the city. Everything is either gone or costs 6 months' rent. I'll just tell them I'm sick." Leo walked into the office and hung the bag on the mahogany doorframe. "That would be a mistake. To retreat now is to tell them that Julian was right about you." "And what am I supposed to wear? A spreadsheet?" she snapped, the stress finally breaking her composure. Leo's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes softened just a fraction. He unzipped the bag with a slow, deliberate motion. "I have a cousin who works in the fashion industry. He had a piece that was sitting in storage. It's a prototype, unlabeled. He was happy to let it be worn by someone who would appreciate it." Alara stood up, walking toward the bag with hesitant steps. As the silk slid back, the light from the office windows seemed to be sucked into the fabric. It was a gown of deep, shimmering crimson, constructed from a material that felt like liquid moonlight. There were no sequins, no gaudy lace, only structural perfection that defied the laws of tailoring. She reached out to touch the hem, her breath catching. "Leo, this isn't a prototype. I've seen things like this in museums. Where did he get this?" "He has many high-end clients," Leo lied smoothly, his face a mask of humble service. "It has no price tag because it was never meant to be sold. It was meant for a queen who hasn't yet found her throne." Alara didn't see the way Leo's hand drifted toward the small of his back, checking the concealed holster beneath his jacket. She didn't know that the cousin was actually the world's premier black market couturier, or that the dress had been liberated from a private vault in Milan 3 hours earlier via a single phone call from a man people called the Ghost. She held the dress against her, looking into the mirror. For the first time in her life, the reflection didn't look like a tired executive drowning in debt and deadlines. It looked like a woman who could bring a city to its knees. "It's too much, Leo. I can't accept this." "It is already paid for, Miss Alara," he said, turning toward the door. "In my world, we do not return gifts. I will be downstairs in 20 minutes. Do not keep the world waiting." As he left, Alara looked at the garment bag. She felt a strange, intoxicating surge of power. She still thought she was a girl being helped by her kind driver. She had no idea that she was about to enter a lion's den, and the lion was the one holding the car door open for her. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets like a shark moving through dark water. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of Alara's crimson silk gown. She stared out the window at the flashing lights of the Vantablack Gala's entrance, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the threshold of a world that ate people like her for breakfast. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at the cars. There are armored Maybachs and custom-built Bentleys. They're going to turn us away before we even hit the curb." Leo didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the line of flashing blue security lights ahead. "They will not turn us away, Miss Alara. You belong here more than any of them." As they reached the primary checkpoint, a fortress of iron gates and stone pillars, a young valet in a stiff uniform stepped forward. He looked at the modest sedan with a sneer of pure condescension, waving a glowing orange baton in a dismissive arc. He didn't even wait for them to stop before pointing toward the general public, exit 3 blocks away. "Move it along. No taxis or private hires allowed past this point," the valet barked, tapping his clipboard against the hood. "This is a closed event. Move." Alara felt the cold sting of humiliation begin to rise, her hand reaching for the door handle to tell Leo to just turn around. But Leo didn't put the car in reverse. Instead, he eased the sedan forward until the bumper was inches from the valet's knees. He rolled down the tinted driver's side window with a slow, mechanical hum. The head of security, a mountain of a man with a jagged scar across his brow and a chest full of tactical gear, strode over to intervene. He was a veteran of the city's private wars, a man paid 6 figures to be the ultimate gatekeeper. He leaned down, ready to drag the driver out of the seat, but as the window disappeared, he froze. Leo didn't say a word. He simply turned his head, his face illuminated by the harsh glare of the security floodlights. He locked eyes with the guard, a gaze that held the weight of 1,000 silent graveyards. The change in the guard was instantaneous and violent. His face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent white. His hand, which had been reaching for his holster, began to shake so uncontrollably that his heavy tactical radio slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the pavement. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't. He looked as though he were staring at a ghost that had come to claim his soul. "Open the gate," the guard whispered, his voice cracking. The young valet stared at his boss in confusion. "But sir, the vehicle isn't on the—" "I said open the gate," the guard roared, his terror turning into a desperate rage. He shoved the valet aside and lunged for the manual override button himself. The massive iron gates groaned and swung open with agonizing slowness. As the sedan rolled forward, the head of security stood at a rigid, trembling attention, his head bowed so low he was staring at his own boots. He didn't look up until the taillights of the cheap car had disappeared into the shadows of the grand driveway. Alara sat in the back, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the back of Leo's head, her mind spinning. "Leo, what just happened? Why did he look at you like that?" "He recognized the car, Miss Alara," Leo said, his voice returning to that humble, toneless baritone. "I told you it's a very reliable vehicle. People respect quality." He pulled the car to a stop directly in front of the grand marble staircase, where the city's elite stood frozen in their own conversations, watching the unremarkable sedan arrive at the place of honor reserved for kings. Leo stepped out, walked around to her door, and opened it with the grace of a seasoned courtier. As Alara stepped out into the golden light, the crimson dress shimmering like a fresh wound, she felt the eyes of the world fall upon her. Behind her, Leo stood in the shadows of the car, his eyes scanning the rooftops for snipers, his hands ready for war, and his face a mask of perfect, invisible service. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, revealing a world of suffocating opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions from the ceiling, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the diamonds and champagne flutes below. As Alara stepped onto the polished marble, the hum of 100 conversations dipped for a heartbeat. In her crimson gown, she looked less like an employee and more like a warning, yet as she moved deeper into the room, the predators of her daily life began to circle. She hadn't made it 10 feet toward the bar before a shadow blocked her path. It was Marcus, the senior partner, flanked by a group of the firm's investors. His face, usually a mask of corporate neutrality, was twisted into a sneer of pure disbelief. Behind him stood Julian, still nursing the ego bruise from the morning, looking at Alara as if she were a glitch in a high-definition reality. "Alara, what on earth are you doing here?" Marcus didn't lower his voice. He wanted the surrounding elite to witness the dissection. "This isn't a staff mixer at a mid-tier steakhouse. This is the Vantablack. Invitations to this room are earned through billions, not by filing reports." Alara straightened her spine, the silk of her dress cool against her skin. "I was invited, Marcus, and I'm here to represent the interests of our firm just like you." Julian stepped forward, his eyes traveling over her dress with a predatory glint. "Invited? By whom? And where did you get that dress, Alara? It looks like it belongs on a runway in Paris, not on a girl who can barely afford the parking fees in this district." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "We checked the guest list. Your name isn't on it. Sneaking in is a criminal offense at this level." You aren't just losing your job tonight. You're looking at a lawsuit that will bury you." The partners leaned in, their expressions hardening into a collective wall of hostility. They were the gatekeepers of this world, and they didn't take kindly to a servant crashing their sanctuary. "Let be clear," Marcus said, his voice cold and loud enough to draw a crowd of socialites. "You are an embarrassment to Sterling and Cross. You come here uninvited, wearing a dress you clearly couldn't have bought honestly, and you think you can mingle with our clients. Who is your date, Alara? Which low-level security guard did you bribe to get past the gate? Or did you just crawl in through the service entrance with the rest of the help?" Alara felt the walls closing in. The golden light of the chandeliers suddenly felt like a spotlight on a stage where she was about to be executed. She looked around the room, desperate for a friendly face, but she found only the cold, amused stares of people who viewed her as a temporary diversion. "My date," Alara began, her voice wavering. She thought of Leo waiting outside in the dark, and for a moment she felt a surge of shame for even involving him in this. "My date is..." "Her date is me." The voice didn't come from behind her. It seemed to resonate from the very architecture of the ballroom itself. It was a voice of absolute, terrifying calm, the kind of voice that stops hearts and ends wars. The circle of partners parted as if sliced by an invisible blade. Walking through the crowd was a man who looked nothing like the driver who had opened the car door 10 minutes ago. He had discarded the chauffeur's cap. His black suit, which Alara had thought was a simple uniform, now looked like armor forged for a god. Every movement he made was calculated, predatory, and brimming with a lethal grace. Leo didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the partners. He walked straight to Alara's side and placed a hand on the small of her back. The touch was light, but the message was a thunderclap. "She is mine." "And you," Leo said, finally turning his gaze toward Marcus. His eyes weren't just cold anymore, they were empty, like the barrel of a gun. "You were just explaining the penalties for trespassing. Please, continue." The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted with the suddenness of a mountain storm. It wasn't just the presence of a new body in the room. It was the way the air seemed to thin around him, turning cold and sharp. The orchestral music, which had been a soaring backdrop of violin and cello, faltered as the conductor's baton wavered. Even the most seasoned socialites felt an instinctive, primal urge to step back, clearing a path for the man who walked as if the marble floor had been laid specifically for his arrival. Leo had shed the invisible skin of a servant. Without the driver's cap, his face was fully revealed, a landscape of sharp angles and a jawline that looked as though it were carved from flint. He didn't rush. He moved with a slow, rhythmic gait, his hands hanging relaxed at his sides, yet every person in his path felt the urge to apologize for existing in his line of sight. Marcus, blinded by a cocktail of champagne and arrogance, didn't feel the danger. He only felt the sting of his authority being challenged in front of his peers. He saw the face of the man who had driven his coffee-stained car that morning, and his face flushed a deep, ugly purple. "You," Marcus spat, his voice cracking the sudden silence of the room. "You actually had the audacity to step foot inside this ballroom." Marcus lunged forward, his face contorted with the rage of a man who believed the world was divided into masters and tools. He reached out a hand, intending to grab Leo's lapel and shove him back toward the service exit. "I don't care how you got past the gates, you low-life chauffeur. You're leaving this building in handcuffs, or I'll have the guards throw you out of a window myself." Marcus's hand never made contact. With a movement so fast it was almost invisible to the naked eye, Leo intercepted Marcus's arm. He didn't strike him. He simply caught the man's wrist in a grip that sounded like dry wood snapping. Marcus's knees buckled instantly, his breath hitching in a wheezing gasp of shock and pain. Leo didn't even look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Alara, checking her for any sign of distress. "A man should be careful where he places his hands," Leo said. His voice was a low, melodic threat that carried to every corner of the silent room. "Bodies have a way of breaking when they are pushed too far." "Let go of me," Marcus hissed, his bravado crumbling into a panicked whimper. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am a senior partner at Sterling and Cross. I am a member of this club. You are nothing. You're a driver, a nobody." Julian stepped forward, sensing his own status was at stake, but he stopped 3 feet away. There was something in the way Leo stood, a perfect, lethal stillness, that told Julian's survival instincts to remain silent. The surrounding crowd of billionaires, usually so quick to mock an outsider, stood paralyzed. They saw the suit. They saw the stance. And for the first time, they began to look past the driver and see the man. Leo leaned in, his face inches from Marcus's. The heat from the golden chandeliers glinted in Leo's eyes, revealing a depth of darkness that Marcus finally recognized. This wasn't the anger of a disgruntled employee. It was the absolute, crushing indifference of a man who had decided Marcus was no longer necessary. "You keep talking about what I am," Leo whispered, the sound chilling the champagne in the glasses nearby. "But you haven't even begun to ask who I was before I decided to drive this lady to work." He released Marcus's wrist with a dismissive flick, sending the powerful executive stumbling back into a table of crystal glassware. The crashing sound of shattering flutes echoed like a gunshot. "The music has stopped," Leo noted, looking toward the stage where the orchestra stood frozen. "It's time for the room to remember its place." The crash of the crystal glassware was still echoing through the vaulted ceiling when a side door opened and a man stepped onto the podium. It was Victor Vane, the host of the evening and the city's undisputed titan of industry. Vane was a man who held the debt of nations in his pocket, a man who had never bowed to anyone in his 60 years of life. He began to speak, his voice booming over the microphone to address his guests, but the words died in his throat the moment his eyes drifted toward the center of the floor. Victor Vane froze. His face, usually a mask of bronze-hard confidence, turned a ghostly ashen gray. The heavy crystal tumbler in his hand slipped from his fingers, hitting the stage with a wet thud and shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't call for security. Instead, the most powerful man in the city stepped off the podium and, with trembling limbs, sank to the floor. His knees hit the marble with a heavy sound that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the building. He lowered his head until his forehead nearly touched the ground, his body shaking with a terror so raw it was contagious. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Then the dominoes began to fall. A senator in the front row, seeing Vane's reaction, turned pale and dropped. A tech mogul followed. Then the socialites, the bankers, and the heiresses. It was a wave of submission that swept through the ballroom like a physical force. Hundreds of people, dressed in millions of dollars of silk and jewels, were suddenly reduced to a sea of bowed heads and trembling shoulders. In the center of the wreckage stood Leo. He was the only man left standing, a pillar of shadow amidst the golden light. He stood over Marcus, who was paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of confusion. Marcus looked up at the man he had called a lowlife, his eyes darting from Leo to the kneeling billionaire host. The reality of his mistake began to settle into his bones, a cold, suffocating weight that made it hard to swallow. Leo didn't move. He didn't have to. The sheer gravity of his presence seemed to warp the space around him. He looked down at Marcus, not with anger, but with the terrifying boredom of a god looking at a speck of dust. "You've had a lot to say today, Marcus," Leo said. His voice was no longer the gravelly baritone of a servant. It was a sound like rolling thunder, deep, resonant, and carrying the vibration of 1,000 unspoken death sentences. "You told my driver to shut up. You told him to get back in his cage." Leo stepped closer, the heels of his boots clicking against the marble with the finality of a gavel. He leaned down, his shadow swallowing Marcus whole. "Now," Leo whispered, the sound cutting through the absolute silence like a razor, "I am telling you to breathe, only if I allow it." Marcus's lungs seized. He stared into Leo's eyes and finally saw what the rest of the room already knew. He wasn't looking at a driver. He wasn't even looking at a man. He was looking at the ghost dawn, the invisible hand that moved the pieces of the world from the shadows. Beside them, Alara stood motionless, her hand pressed to her lips. She was the only other person standing, a splash of crimson in a room of black and white. She looked at the man she had tipped $5 that morning, the man who had quietly carried her groceries and opened her doors, and realized that the world she lived in was merely a toy he had been watching over for her sake. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, as if the sheer weight of the room's collective fear had increased the gravity. Marcus remained huddled on the floor, his expensive suit bunching at the knees, his eyes wide and glazed with the realization that his life, as he knew it, had ended the moment he touched Leo's sleeve. He looked like a man drowning on dry land, gasping for air that Leo had just claimed ownership of. Leo did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, matte black phone. The glow of the screen illuminated the sharp, merciless lines of his face. He tapped a single command and held the device to his ear for only a second. "Dissolve the Sterling and Cross holdings," Leo whispered into the receiver. "Start with Marcus's offshore accounts, then the firm's credit lines. By the time the sun rises, I want his name erased from every ledger in this city. If anyone resists, buy them. If they can't be bought, break them." He ended the call without waiting for a reply. The silence that followed was broken only by the frantic chirping of phones throughout the room. One by one, the kneeling executives felt their pockets vibrate. Marcus's own phone began to buzz incessantly against the marble floor, a digital death knell. He reached for it with trembling fingers, seeing the notifications: accounts frozen, assets seized, termination of partnership. His empire, built on decades of backstabbing and greed, had been dismantled in less time than it took for a heart to beat. Elara stood in the eye of the storm, the only person besides Leo who remained upright. From her vantage point, the room looked like a surreal painting, a sea of the world's most arrogant people reduced to penitent shadows. She looked at Leo, and for the first time, she didn't see the man who adjusted the car's climate control or knew her favorite coffee order. She saw the ghost dawn. He was the myth spoken about in the dark corners of boardrooms, the phantom who controlled the flow of the city's lifeblood without ever being seen. He was the reason why certain politicians disappeared and why certain companies tripled in value overnight. He wasn't her driver. He was the architect of the reality she lived in. "Leo," she breathed, the name feeling strange and small in her mouth. He turned his head toward her. The predatory edge in his eyes didn't vanish, but it softened as it landed on her. For a moment, the terrifying monarch was gone, replaced by the man who had sat in the rain for 3 hours just to ensure she got home safely. "The trash has been collected, Elara," he said, his voice dropping from the roar of thunder back to that familiar, low vibration. "They thought they could humiliate you because they mistook my silence for weakness. They forgot that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the lion that roars, it's the one that watches." Marcus let out a low, broken sob, his forehead touching the cool stone. He was a ghost now, a man with no money, no influence, and no future. Leo walked past him as if he were nothing more than a stain on the floor, his focus entirely on the woman in the crimson dress. The kneeling guests didn't move. They didn't dare to breathe until the ghost dawn gave them leave. Elara realized then that the man she had tipped $5 was the man who could decide if the sun rose tomorrow. The power was intoxicating, terrifying, and absolute. She had spent her life trying to climb a ladder that he had built just to see if she was worth catching when she fell. The silence in the ballroom was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of hundreds of prayers for mercy. As the digital ruin of Marcus's life flickered on phone screens across the room, the focus of the gathered elite shifted from the fallen man to the woman standing in the center of the wreckage. Leo took a slow, deliberate step toward Elara. The predatory stillness that had terrified the room didn't vanish, but it transformed. He reached out his hand, palm upward, in a gesture of profound, public deference. It was a silent command to the room. The hierarchy had changed. He was no longer the man behind the wheel, and she was no longer the employee fighting for a seat at the table. "The night is far from over, Elara," Leo said, his voice carrying clearly over the bowed heads of the city's most powerful. "But from this moment on, you will never walk behind anyone again." Elara hesitated for a heartbeat, her fingers trembling as she placed her hand in his. The moment their skin met, a visible ripple of shock passed through the kneeling guests. To the world, the ghost Don was a myth of cold steel and iron will, a man who trusted no one and loved nothing. By taking her hand, he wasn't just escorting her, he was anointing her. He was declaring her the only person in the world with the power to command the man who commanded them. As Leo began to lead her toward the grand exit, the path ahead of them cleared with desperate speed. People who had spent the evening whispering about Alara's cheap origins now scrambled to press their foreheads closer to the marble as she passed. The partners of Sterling and Cross, men who had spent years making Alara feel small, now looked like broken dolls. One of them, a man who had laughed the loudest at Julian's jokes, began to mutter a frantic apology under his breath as her crimson hem brushed his hand. Alara didn't look down. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, her chin tilted up, finally inhabiting the skin of the woman the dress had promised she could be. She realized that the people kneeling weren't just afraid of Leo, they were terrified of her memory. They were praying she didn't remember the insults, the coffee spills, or the dismissive sneers. They were praying she was more merciful than the man whose hand she held. Julian, still paralyzed near the shattered glassware, tried to find his voice. "Alara, please, I didn't know, I thought." Leo didn't even stop walking. He simply turned his head slightly, a shark-like glint in his eyes. "You thought she was alone," Leo interrupted, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking I was just watching her. I was waiting for someone to prove they were unworthy of being in the same city as her. Thank you for making the choice so easy." As they reached the massive oak doors, the head of security, the same man who had dropped his radio at the gate, threw them open with a bow so deep it looked painful. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a fleet of black SUVs sat idling, their headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of waiting wolves. Alara felt the shift in the air, a cold, intoxicating clarity. The world she had known, the world of spreadsheets, bullying bosses, and glass ceilings, had been burned to ash behind her. In its place was a kingdom of shadows and absolute power. She wasn't the girl who needed a driver anymore. She was the woman who had the ghost Dawn at her side, and as they stepped out into the night, the city below them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her first command. The city moved on, unaware that its crown had shifted hands in the silence of a ballroom. Alara leaned back against the leather, finally understanding that the greatest power in the world isn't found in a bank account or a title. It's found in the quiet strength of the man who can rule a world, yet chooses to open a door for a stranger. The world is a grand, elaborate stage, and most people are so blinded by the costumes that they never see the actors. They see a suit and assume a leader. They see a uniform and assume a servant. They forget that the person they think is just a driver might be the one holding the keys to their entire destiny. They forget that the man they push in the street might be the one who decides if they have a street to walk on tomorrow. Never mistreat someone simply because they chose to be humble. The mask of the commoner is often the greatest test a king can set for his subjects. For when that mask eventually falls and the costume is stripped away, the only thing that remains is the way you acted when you thought no one was watching. And in that moment of revelation, you may find yourself kneeling before the very person you once looked down upon, realizing too late that the person you thought you were leading was the one driving you toward your own judgment. But as the lights of the gala faded into the distance, a final thought lingered in the air. If you were in Alara's shoes, would you be able to trust the man who had lied to you for months, even if those lies were meant to protect you? Or would you wonder what other secrets the ghost Dawn is still keeping in the shadows? What would you do? Would you stay by his side, or would you run from the danger his name carries? Let us know in the comments below. If this story reminded you that true power is always silent, hit the like button and subscribe. We bring you the most intense tales of hidden identities and legendary reveals. Don't miss our next story, because you never know who is watching from the shadows.